Alright, YouTube. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about if you're having battery issues in a TJ Wrangler. Specifically, this was a 99 Wrangler for my friend, and gosh, we had problems with the battery voltage dropping off. I'll talk about that a little later, but the first part of this video I want to actually talk about the PCM, which is basically the computer. You got your 3 ports. It's up against the firewall on the back part of the Jeep, and I don't recommend opening this, but if you have to, I didn't actually see anywhere online that shows you how to, and maybe you won't make the same mistake that we did. So basically, if you go around the edges here, there is going to be glue, or adhesive, whatever, and you have to heat it up. But it's not along this top part, just these 3 where the ports are. And then once you get it peeled away, the way you open it is you have to open it like a clamshell. So these pry actually open, and as you can see inside, you've got board on both sides. Sorry, it's tough to see there, upside down. You've got various capacitors and whatnot, so you have to pry it open enough to where you can just get this metal divider part out. And then you can look down in, and you see at the very, very bottom, you have the ribbon cables across, which is why you don't want to, there's no glue actually at the very top part, or bottom part of the clamshell, I guess you want to call it. As you can tell, we messed up the ribbon cable, so we had to get a new one. Because we were thinking there might be a solder issue at first with our battery problems. It turned out it wasn't. So it is a very expensive lesson to learn. But in case you're wondering how to open a PCM on a TJ Wrangler for these various years, that's how you do it. Now, if you continue to the next part of the video, I'm going to talk about how we went about solving our battery issue, and also things that you want to look at that will be your first thing you should look at, the primary culprits. Talk about the voltage regulator, cleaning your terminals, all that stuff. So just stick around and I'll talk about that. Okay, welcome back to the video. I'm going to talk about some of the various things to check if you're having voltage issues with your Wrangler. The voltage gauge is either shooting full blast or dropping out, or maybe both, or some other indicators like a really hot battery is getting overcharged. There's a few things that you really want to look at and do first, and we're going to talk about that right now. Okay, so the arrow here obviously is pointing at the PCM we looked at in the first part of the video. 3 plugs, screws hold it to the firewall of the Jeep, or the rear engine wall. It's likely it's not going to be your issue. These things do go bad, but it is rare. They're relatively expensive, 50, 100, 150, anywhere from, you could find them online. This is going to be one of the last things you want to replace or check, or just to throw money at. There's a few other options you want to do first, but I'm going to point that out first. Okay, now here's the first thing that you want to do. I've circled both battery terminal posts here. What you're going to want to do is, obviously you're going to take the battery out, but you want to clean the posts really well and clean the connectors especially. These Jeeps are very sensitive to ground issues, and if you don't have very clean contacts, then this could be your issue. It could be as simple as that. What you're also going to want to do is look for ground connections, like chassis ground. There's an engine ground. You also want to go from the positive terminal and look. There's connections down at the starter motor, at the alternator, the fusible link, which we'll talk about next. You just want to check all these connections and make sure they're relatively clean. They're not crusted over. They're not dirty. Engine oil, all that stuff. Just make sure you've got clean, especially good grounds, and that will be your first step. Okay, now what I've circled is the fuse box terminal part, and there will be a cable coming from there. It's called a fusible link, and if it gets too much power or surges, this fusible link blows to protect the fuse box there. So what you're going to want to do is to check that. It's about I don't know, an 8-inch cable typically, maybe a little more, I forget offhand, but you check continuity for that and make sure the fusible link is still intact. And moving on. Oh, and one more thing I forgot to mention. On my friend's year's model, 99 and I think 2000, they might have only done it for 2 years, but underneath the battery is something called the battery temperature sensor, believe it or not. And it's basically just a thermistor or a temperature, a resistor that monitors temperature. Basically, it's got wax in it and melts, and then it sends off a resistance. So if the battery gets too hot as it's getting overcharged, it'll send a signal to also shut off, the alternator and whatnot. So if you're having alternator issues, it could be as simple as a cheap little battery sensor, temperature sensor. But Jeep ended up getting rid of this after 2 years. They just scrapped the whole thing. But you might have it in yours, and it might be your issue. So look into that as well. All right. Now what I've circled is the location of the alternator. It's obviously not on top. It's actually below. But it's pretty relatively straightforward to be able to take out. I mean, obviously you're going to want to test the voltage to see if it's bad, or you have to take it out and you can take it to an auto parts store to get it tested under load. They have the machines there. They'll test it for free. Just to make sure that your alternator is good. And I mentioned earlier, look at the connections, make sure the connections are all good there as well. But the next part is the Jeeps, the alternators in these Jeeps do not have built-in voltage regulators to the alternator. The voltage regulator is actually back in the computer, and this is what I'm going to talk about next, which ended up being our issue. Okay, so the path you're looking at now, the green line, is the path that the two wires from the alternator, the field driver and the voltage regulator wire, they take from the PCM, go behind the engine, up along the fuel injectors, to the front of the engine and down and to the back of the alternator there. And the issue that we had was, in particular, the voltage regulator wire was broken to the point where I could grab the harness and just bend it a little bit, and it would cause the issue immediately. And it was just something that small can affect it. They do sell external voltage regulator kits online. We didn't need to do that. We opened the harness ourselves. It was a pain in the rear end, but we got to install the brake, and we resoldered and heat shrunk, added some more heat shrunk tubing around the wire, and haven't had an issue since. The voltage regulator itself, if that goes bad, I mean, you might have to add the external one, or you have to replace the PCM. The voltage regulator is in the computer, so it can't be serviced. If it's just a wire, you're lucky you can resolder it. Yeah, also if you have that battery temperature sensor, that wire also comes from the PCM there, and it just goes right below the battery, so that's easy to check for a break as well. And I'll show you a few the wiring diagrams from the service manual and the alternator harness connector too, in just various pictures. But I hope this video has given you somewhat of a, this was a lot of information for me to learn, so hopefully this video can help a few other people so they can save a little bit of time, maybe not do the wrong thing. And comment below. I'll try to help out, and maybe other people can chime in if I made a mistake as well, or I overlooked something. Please do. I always appreciate constructive criticism. Here's just a simple diagram of the harness connector for your alternator. The two colors of the wires. Here's PCM connector C2, the middle one, and you can see there's the field driver wire. Okay, and here is PCM harness connector C3, and the two wires you'll probably want to check. Obviously your battery temperature sensor signal if you've got that, and your voltage regulator signal. And it's important to check for breaks, because we got fooled. There was continuity, but it was intermittent, so the Jeep would work and then the issue would just keep popping back up because the wire was broken, but sometimes it would still conduct and then other times it wouldn't. So pay attention for that as well.